The bright studio lights of CNN gleamed across the polished debate stage where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat opposite Harvard law icon Alan Dershowitz. The air felt electric, charged with the quiet intensity that comes before a verbal storm. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Crockett's composed yet razor-focused expression. Moments earlier, Dershowitz had concluded a lengthy defense of presidential immunity, his tone brimming with the self-assuredness of a man accustomed to dominance in legal debates. "No one," he declared, "has defended executive privilege with greater consistency than I have in my 50 years of scholarship." Crockett leaned forward slightly, her microphone close, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. As a former public defender and civil rights attorney, she'd spent her life facing down power. This was just another courtroom, only televised. She waited for the hush that followed his statement, then prepared to drop a single question that would stop him cold. When it came, the professor froze. His words faltered, color drained from his face, and for the first time in his storied career, Alan Dershowitz had no reply. The audience gasped. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. It wasn't merely a debate, it was a moment, one that would light up social media within minutes. Before we unpack that explosive exchange, take a second to like and subscribe, where we bring you the most intense debates, real political showdowns, and moments that redefine the conversation in Washington. Under the unforgiving glow of the lights, Dershowitz looked every bit the seasoned intellectual. Silver hair, trademark glasses, tailored suit, the image of an elder statesman of American law. At 85, he carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court and represented names that shaped history. O.J. Simpson, Donald Trump, and more. "I've defended the Constitution for half a century," he said, his tone unshaken. "My belief in presidential power has never depended on who occupies the Oval Office." The CNN special, Presidential Powers, the Constitutional Crossroads, had drawn record-breaking viewership. The nation was tuned in, anxious to understand the limits of presidential authority in a time of deep political division. Across the stage, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat poised, representing Texas's 30th District. At 42, she was a fresh but formidable voice in Congress, known for her viral committee takedowns and fearless approach to political confrontation. Her sharp blue suit shimmered beneath the studio lights, her expression confident, her presence magnetic. She wasn't there to play defense. She came to redefine the argument. "Congresswoman," the moderator began, "you've been outspoken against expanding presidential power. What's your core concern?" Crockett adjusted her microphone. "My concern is simple," she said clearly. "Equal justice under law. It's carved above the Supreme Court for a reason. No American should ever be above the law, whether they live in public housing or the White House." Applause rippled across the audience. Dershowitz smirked faintly, waving a dismissive hand. "A noble slogan," he said, "but it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of separation of powers. The presidency isn't ordinary. It's unique." Crockett's eyes glimmered. Her team had spent weeks studying his past interviews and publications. They'd found the contradiction that could unravel his entire legacy. As CNN cut to a commercial break, producers backstage could feel the rising tension. "Something big's coming," one whispered. This wasn't just another policy debate. It was a generational collision, old authority versus new authenticity. When the broadcast resumed, the moderator turned to Dershowitz. "Professor, you've spent decades writing about presidential immunity. For our audience, could you summarize your position?" "With pleasure," he said smoothly. "The Constitution gives the president distinct powers as head of the executive branch. While no one is above the law, limited immunity ensures effective governance. That's been my consistent view for 50 years, regardless of the party in power." Crockett raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, letting him continue. "The founders," he added, "intended impeachment, not criminal prosecution, as the remedy for misconduct. That principle has never changed in my analysis." The moderator nodded. "Congresswoman Crockett, your response?" Crockett leaned in slightly. "Professor Dershowitz speaks a lot about consistency," she said evenly. But I'd like to explore that claim. The audience leaned closer. During President Clinton's impeachment, she continued, you said high crimes didn't need to be criminal offenses. But during President Trump's impeachment, you argued the exact opposite. How do you reconcile that contradiction? A low murmur rippled through the audience. Dershowitz's smile faltered. That's a mischaracterization, he replied quickly. In the Clinton case, I was discussing the historical interpretation of impeachment. During Trump's, I analyzed whether the specific charges fit that framework. Crockett opened a folder, flipping precisely to a marked page. In 1998, she read, you said, impeachment doesn't need to be based on a crime. Yet in 2019, you said it must be comparable to a criminal act. Those aren't two contexts. Professor, those are two opposites. The color in his cheeks deepened. Context matters, Congresswoman. Crockett tilted her head slightly. Does it? Because the only context that changed was who sat in the Oval Office. The audience erupted, half gasps, half applause. I've defended principles, not parties, he shot back. Unlike some politicians, I don't follow polls or trends. Crockett's tone remained calm, deliberate. With all due respect, Professor, principles that change with the political wind aren't principles at all. The moderator tried to ease the tension. Let's move back to the current Supreme Court case. With respect, Crockett interjected, I think this goes to the heart of the question. Consistency, she continued. In your 2004 book, Rights from Wrongs, you wrote that no president should ever be shielded from judicial review. Yet in 2020, you argued that presidents have broad immunity for acts they believe serve the national interest. What changed? You're twisting my meaning, he replied, voice rising. In 2004, I referred to actions outside official duties. In 2020, I spoke of actions within constitutional authority. Crockett flipped another page. So your stance depends on what qualifies as an official act? Of course, he snapped. That's basic constitutional law. Crockett's tone stayed calm. And who decides what counts as official? The courts, he said sharply. Courts you've both supported and attacked depending on the administration, she replied quietly. The room went still. Even the producers backstage leaned forward. Dershowitz's calm veneer was cracking. Then came the turning point. Congressman, he began. It's Congresswoman, she corrected gently, her voice unwavering. And I know your resume, Professor. But there's an old saying in law, when the facts are on your side, argue the facts. When the law's on your side, argue the law. And when neither is... She paused, the silence stretching. You pound the table. The audience exploded. Applause, gasps, laughter. Dershowitz looked down, lips tight. The moderator quickly called for a break, his voice slightly shaky. As cameras faded to black, Dershowitz leaned toward his aide, muttering, She's performing, not debating. He didn't realize the mic was still live. Crockett, calm and focused, reviewed her notes. Every exchange had unfolded exactly as planned. The next question, the one waiting after the break, would expose the flaw even Dershowitz couldn't argue away. When the show returned, the moderator's voice carried the weight of the moment. We're entering our final segment. Professor Dershowitz, you've defended the consistency of your constitutional interpretations for decades. Congresswoman Crockett, you've challenged those claims. Let's give each of you a closing opportunity to present your case. Dershowitz spoke first, his tone scholarly but noticeably strained. Throughout my career, I've been guided by constitutional principles, not political loyalties, he began. Yes, legal thought evolves over time, but my foundation has always been steady. The presidency requires certain immunities to function properly regardless of who occupies the office. Protecting the institution, not the individual, is what truly matters. He gestured confidently toward the audience. Congresswoman Crockett has selectively quoted my work out of context to imply inconsistency where there is none. It's a familiar tactic when substantive arguments fall short. I stand by every opinion I've offered because each was grounded in constitutional reasoning relevant to its moment. The camera panned to Jasmine Crockett, who nodded politely as he finished. When it was her turn, she thanked the moderator, then turned slightly, addressing both Dershowitz and the audience. Professor Dershowitz speaks eloquently about consistency and constitutional values. She began, her voice measured yet firm. But there's one crucial question that still needs an answer. She reached for a document on the table. The studio fell completely silent. Professor. She continued, "In your 1998 book, Sexual McCarthyism, you wrote, and I quote, if a president committed murder and claimed it was an official act because the victim posed a national security threat, no one would seriously argue that presidential immunity would protect him from prosecution. You repeated that point several times in interviews during the Clinton administration." Crockett then looked up directly at him. "Yet in 2020, during President Trump's impeachment trial, you told the Senate that if a president believes their re-election serves the national interest, then actions taken to secure that re-election cannot be impeachable. You said, quote, if a president does something he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment." The room went silent. The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's face as the weight of the question landed. For a long moment, he said nothing. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For perhaps the first time in his public career, Alan Dershowitz appeared truly speechless. The audience held its breath. Even the moderator, clearly stunned, hesitated to speak. Finally, Dershowitz attempted to respond. That's an outrageous distortion of my argument. Obviously, murder would be, I'm quoting your exact words, Professor Crockett interjected calmly. In 1998, you said presidential murder could not be protected by immunity. In 2020, you said actions taken to secure an election, if believed to serve the national interest, cannot be impeachable. Those are two entirely different standards. So which one represents your actual position? Dershowitz's face wrinkled. You're creating a false choice, Congresswoman. No serious reading of my 2020 statement would ever include something as extreme as murder. But your argument didn't include any limitation, Crockett pressed, her tone still even. You claim that any action taken for re-election in the name of national interest is beyond impeachment. You didn't specify exceptions. So where exactly is your line, and why did it shift so dramatically between 1998 and 2020? The studio was silent again as Dershowitz visibly struggled to form a coherent response. The contexts were entirely different, he stammered. The only thing that changed, Crockett replied, was the party of the president. The audience gasped, followed by an eruption of applause. The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's stunned expression as he realized he had walked right into her carefully planned trap. It's a cheap shot, he managed, his composure faltering. My career has been dedicated to defending civil liberties across party lines. Your record, Crockett countered, is exactly what I'm questioning, not your education or experience, but your consistency on the most fundamental constitutional question of all. The American people deserve to know whether your interpretation of presidential power depends on who holds the office. The audience erupted again, recognizing that they had just witnessed a moment destined to dominate headlines across the nation. The moderator, aware of the historic weight of what was unfolding live on air, chose not to interrupt. He allowed the exchange to continue, sensing this was a moment that would be remembered. Dershowitz tried to regain control of the discussion. Congresswoman, your question builds on a hypothetical that twists my actual position, he began, voice shaky but attempting composure. It's not a hypothetical. Professor Crockett cut in sharply, holding up a folder of papers. I'm quoting your own recorded words. In 1998, you clearly stated that a president committing murder could not claim immunity. In 2020, you argued that any action taken in the name of re-election, if the president believes it's in the national interest, is not impeachable. These two positions cannot coexist. The camera zoomed in on Dershowit's face as the contradiction hit him in real time. His long-cultivated image of constitutional consistency, the very core of his reputation, was collapsing in front of millions of viewers. I would need to review the full context of those statements, Heffenly muttered, his confidence visibly eroding. I have the full transcripts right here, Crockett replied evenly, patting the folder on the desk. Would you like me to read more? The audience erupted in applause and gasps. The CNN moderator, realizing the exchange would dominate headlines for days, finally stepped in. We need to wrap up. Professor Dershowitz, your final response. Straightening his tie, Dershowitz tried to steady himself. The Congresswoman is engaging in political theater with issues far more complex than this debate allows. Anyone who studies constitutional law understands that context matters. My arguments have evolved through deeper legal understanding, not partisanship, but the usual confidence was gone. Even casual viewers could see he had avoided the question. The moderator turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, your closing thoughts." Crockett nodded and looked straight into the camera. "The Constitution is not a political tool to be bent by whoever holds power. Equal justice under law must mean exactly that, equal. When our top legal voices shift their interpretations depending on party affiliation, public faith in our democracy crumbles. This isn't a partisan issue. It's an American one." She turned back to Dershowitz. "Professor, I respect your years of scholarship. But in this question on presidential power, the people deserve clarity and consistency, not theories that change with political winds." As the moderator closed the segment, it was clear the damage was done. Alan Dershowitz, long revered for his legal intellect, had been publicly cornered by his own words, and Jasmine Crockett, armed only with transcripts and precision, had done what few ever managed. She left the Harvardicon completely speechless. Moments after the broadcast ended, the internet exploded. The phrase "Crockett destroys Dershowitz" trended across platforms. The 45-second clip showing his stunned silence spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views within the first hour. Major outlets quickly picked up the story. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow replayed the full exchange and remarked, "What we witnessed tonight was remarkable." Congresswoman Crockett exposed a core contradiction in Professor Dershowitz's arguments that even he couldn't reconcile. Even Fox News, where Dershowitz had often appeared as a contributor, struggled to defend him regardless of political leaning. One analyst said, "Failing to answer that central question is deeply concerning for someone of Dershowitz's stature." Inside the CNN studio, energy buzzed long after the camera stopped rolling. Crockett gathered her papers as staff members approached, offering congratulations for what many were already calling a defining moment in modern political discourse. As she walked toward the green room, her phone lit up with messages, texts, alerts, and calls pouring in from colleagues and national figures. One senior Democratic senator messaged, "You did what the entire legal world has tried to do for years. You caught him in his own contradiction, and he had nowhere to run." Meanwhile, Dershowitz exited quickly, avoiding follow-up interviews. His publicist issued a short statement. "Professor Dershowitz appreciates the chance to discuss important constitutional matters. Such issues often demand more nuance than television formats can provide. He looks forward to addressing them in scholarly venues, but the explanation only fueled further criticism." Legal analysts noted that Dershowitz had long used TV appearances to make bold, sweeping claims about presidential power, only retreating to academic nuance when challenged. By morning, the confrontation dominated every major newspaper. The New York Times ran the headline in a stunning on-air clash. Crockett challenges Dershowitz on presidential power contradictions. The Washington Post went even further. Dershowitz speechless. How Congresswoman Crockett exposed double standards in constitutional debate. Across universities, law professors began discussing the exchange in classrooms. At Harvard Law, where Dershowitz had taught for decades, students organized a special symposium titled Constitutional Consistency, the Crockett Question. The political impact of the debate was enormous. Jasmine Crockett, already seen as a fast-rising figure in progressive politics, suddenly found herself being discussed as a potential Senate candidate and even a future presidential contender. Her precise, disciplined dismantling of one of America's most renowned constitutional lawyers displayed an uncommon blend of intellect and strategic skill rarely seen in modern politics. "What made this moment historic?" explained one CNN political analyst. "Wasn't just that Congresswoman Crockett challenged Professor Dershowitz. It's that she used his own words to reveal a deep inconsistency that had existed in his arguments for decades. She didn't insult him personally or rely on theatrics. She simply let his record expose itself." 3 days after the televised exchange, Dershowitz tried to repair the damage by publishing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Textual Constitutional Interpretation is Not Inconsistency," but the attempt backfired. The comment section was quickly filled with variations of Crockett's still unanswered question. While legal scholars across blogs and news outlets methodically picked apart Heiss' explanations, within a week, CNN announced that the debate had become their most viewed clip of the year, surpassing 15 million views across platforms. The phrase "pulling a Crockett entered popular political vocabulary," meaning to corner an opponent using their own contradictory statements for Jasmine Crockett. The aftermath brought both opportunity and new responsibility. Interview requests poured in from major networks. Democratic leaders began including her in high-level constitutional briefings. Her donor base exploded, powered by small contributions from across the country by viewers inspired by her composure and intellect. What we witnessed wasn't just a political victory, said a respected constitutional scholar during a Harvard panel discussion. It was a reaffirmation that accountability still matters. When public figures change their principles to serve partisan goals, they should be challenged exactly as Congresswoman Crockett did. Even more importantly, the debate reshaped the national conversation about presidential authority and legal consistency. Commentators who once accepted partisan double standards began facing tougher scrutiny. Cable news hosts started confronting guests with their past statements, a practice soon dubbed the Crockett test. 2 weeks later, Crockett appeared on 60 Minutes to reflect on the event and its aftermath. When asked if she had anticipated Dershowitz's inability to answer, she smiled. "I wasn't trying to embarrass Professor Dershowitz," she said calmly. "My goal was to highlight something deeper, a problem in our constitutional dialogue. When our interpretations shift with the political winds, we weaken the very foundation of the rule of law. That's not a partisan issue. That's an American issue." The interviewer pressed further. "But did you know he wouldn't have an answer?" Crockett paused, thoughtful. "I knew he couldn't have a consistent answer," she said. "The contradiction between his 1998 and 2020 positions is simply irreconcilable." What surprised me most was that no one had ever asked him directly to explain that contradiction. As the interview concluded, the correspondent revealed that Professor Dershowitz had declined 60 Minutes' invitation to appear, citing that he was writing a new book exploring constitutional power in more depth. Crockett smiled faintly. "I look forward to reading it," she said. "But constitutional principles shouldn't depend on who sits in the Oval Office. That was true in 1998. It was true in 2020, and it's true today." By that point, the moment had moved far beyond a single televised clash. It had become a defining reference in political and legal circles, a reminder that even the most celebrated experts must be held accountable for intellectual contradictions. For Jasmine Crockett, the exchange marked her evolution from promising freshman lawmaker to a leading national voice on constitutional integrity. For Alan Dershowitz, it represented a rare, humbling reckoning after decades of dominance and public debate. And for the American people, it offered a rare moment of clarity in an often clouded discussion about presidential authority and principle. 6 months later, as the Supreme Court took up a new case on presidential immunity, reporters began asking every major witness and politician a familiar question. Would your position be the same if the president were from the opposite party? That question, now widely known as the Crockett Standard, had become the new measure of intellectual honesty in American political life. What began a sewn-pointed question in a CNN debate had evolved into a nationwide call for consistency principle and the true meaning of equal justice under law. And as commentators across the spectrum acknowledged, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a debate. She had changed the national standard for truth itself.